Spoiled sister asked to borrow my new Mercedes for her road trip with her friends. I refused, but my parents gave her the keys behind my back. She came back from her road trip without my car, so I pulled the ultimate revenge on her. My sister and I have always had a contentious relationship. Is she what you'd call a gifted student? She gets excellent grades with hardly any effort. I, on the other hand, work tirelessly to achieve results but have never been able to match her. My parents see academic success as the utmost priority, so my sister has always received preferential treatment at home. Once my parents recognized her as the brains of the family, they completely neglected me. I was like a ghost in the house, while she used her status to belittle me. With my parents' help, she got about 3 times my allowance. They didn't hesitate to take my dessert to give to her, deeming her more deserving. I became her punching bag, and since I wasn't as intellectual as her, I started working early and began earning money. As long as I lived under my parents' roof, they forced me to give her a portion of my earnings, claiming I owed it for living with them, which became unbearable. I dropped out of school, and my sister went on to university, fully supported by our parents who paid for her new apartment, tuition, food, and trips. To limit my interactions with my family, I decided to get my own apartment without any financial help from my parents, not even for the deposit or first month's rent. One day, my little sister asked our parents if she could borrow their car for her road trip to Spain with her friends. The trip, including her driver's license, was fully funded by my parents, of course. This time, however, my parents couldn't lend her their car because they needed it for work, so they suggested she ask me. By that point, I had saved a significant portion of my earnings. I was now 22, my sister was 19, and I had started saving at 16 to buy a Mercedes Class S, a car I had always dreamed of owning. Sorry for the confusion. So, my sister had the audacity to ask me if she could use my Mercedes for her road trip to Spain with her friends while we were having dinner at my parents'. Obviously said no, which she took as an affront. My parents seemed guilty, as though they were troubled by the fact they could no longer force me to do anything for my sister. That day, I could see their disappointment. My sister was supposed to leave in a week, and they were really counting on my car, but they didn't say anything, perhaps understanding that things had changed. Despite moving out, I stayed close to my parents' house since I chose an apartment near my work. I worked for a gardening company, just 2 kilometers from my place and my parents'. A few days later, my parents' car broke down. My mother asked if I could drive my father to the doctor since he had severe diabetes and needed regular checkups. Unfortunately, the appointment was during my work hours, and my mother knew this. She proposed to take him herself and park the car at their house, so I could pick it up later. I was suspicious, but since our relationship had started to improve, I didn't want to ruin it. Besides, my sister was leaving in 3 days, and I thought they couldn't possibly betray my trust like this. So, I went to work on foot. I had a bad feeling all day and was due back home around 10 p.m. I follow my sister on social media, but she doesn't follow me back because she thinks she's superior, especially on Instagram. As I was walking home from work, I opened Instagram, only to be shocked by what I saw on my sister's story. She and her friends were posing with their dirty shoes on the dashboard of my brand new Mercedes Class S. I planned to confront my parents for an explanation, but dark thoughts were already crossing my mind. I was seething with rage, unsure of what my parents would say, but as planned, I headed to their place to look for the car they claimed to have left out front, obviously. As expected, when I arrived at my parents' place, there was nothing but their own cars. I was utterly dumbfounded. To my surprise, despite it being past 10:30 p.m., my parents were waiting for me at the gate for some unknown reason. I approached them, furious, demanding to know what had happened to my car. They apologized profusely, explaining that my sister really needed it for her road trip to Spain, insisting on having my Mercedes. They suggested I could use their cars for the time being. They seemed overwhelmed, probably lacking the strength to say no to my sister. They tried their best to calm me down, but it was tough. Opening Instagram, I saw photos of her and her friends, whom I also despised, in my car. I felt a bit sorry for my parents, but they had betrayed me in the worst possible way. Nonetheless, I demanded they call my sister immediately, which they did. They tried to hand the phone to her, but she refused to speak to me. They got her to promise to return the car in the condition she found it, treating it as carefully as possible. I returned to my apartment, furious, but considering my parents' effort, I thought if she returned my car in good condition within 2 weeks, I'd let it go, for the sake of our relationship. Noticing I often dined at my parents since they were the only link to my sister and thus my car. Given her refusal to speak to me, I wanted to make her pay, but my parents said they were helpless. About a week into her trip, which she started 3 days early to ensure she had my car, I went to have dinner at my parents'. I couldn't explain why, but they seemed extremely anxious that day. They awkwardly assured me during dinner that everything was fine and the car was in good shape, but I sensed they were lying. It had been a week since she left, with 18 days until her return. I went home, planning to visit again in 3 days. During that time, I noticed my sister's stories no longer featured my Mercedes. When the day came, I asked my parents about the car. My mother burst into tears and ran upstairs. I started to fear the worst. My father looked me in the eye and bluntly stated that my car had been lost in Malaga. Devastated yet incredulous, I suggested checking local impounds. He explained that 2 days later, my sister had checked all nearby impounds, but none had any record of my car. It appeared to have been stolen. I asked my father one last time if this was some kind of joke. He replied that if it were, my mother wouldn't have left crying. I had saved for years to afford that Mercedes, and my pampered sister, who always had everything handed to her on a silver platter, had just destroyed my most prized possession. I knew this was a critical moment. I was determined to make her pay dearly. A memory flashed through my mind. As a child, when punished, my parents would often hide my belongings, like game controllers, to distract me. I headed for the small closet in the living room, where they used to hide my things. My father had gone to comfort my mother in their bedroom. Opening the closet, I found exactly what I needed, the keys to the new apartment my parents had bought for my sister for university. I was about to give her a taste of her own medicine. You can now check if there's a third part by pressing share and more. Spoiled sister asked to borrow my new Mercedes for her road trip with her friends. I refused, but my parents gave her the keys behind my back. She came back from her road trip without my car, so I pulled the ultimate revenge on her. Part 3. My sister was supposed to return in about a week, giving me little time to act. My parents might soon notice the missing apartment key. I left their house without saying goodbye while they were upstairs. On my way home, my dad called. Fearing he had discovered the missing keys, I was relieved to find that wasn't the case. Instead, he apologized and promised to help me pay for a new car in a few years. I hung up on him, attempting to reach my sister. I was surprised when she actually answered, likely due to my parents' pressure. I confronted her about her audacity. She deflected, accusing me of making our mother cry. Shocked by her audacity, I pressed on, only for her to dismissively suggest I could easily afford another car with my years of savings. She accused me of being ungrateful and insensitive, prioritizing material possessions over our mother. Deep down, her words only fueled my resolve for what I planned next. I'd be taking my paid leave for the next 3 days. Knowing my city well, despite having visited my sister's apartment only once in 2 years, I remembered its location. My time away from school had acquainted me with the city's rougher parts, where homelessness and drug use were rampant. Encountering a particularly disheveled group living in tents, I concocted a story about offering them housing through a nonprofit. Believing they were about to receive long-term accommodation, 8 individuals eagerly followed me. We took a 30-minute bus ride to my sister's upscale neighborhood, which I paid for. Arriving at her apartment building, we waited for someone to let us in. Once inside, we ascended to the 3rd floor and I unlocked her apartment. It was immaculate, with pristine white walls and furnishings, including a drum set and a piano, spread across its modest 34 square meters. Despite feeling a pang of guilt, remembering her contemptuous words solidified my decision. I welcomed the 8 homeless individuals into the apartment, handing them the keys and informing them it was theirs now. Imagining my sister's reaction upon discovering her new roommates and the inevitable odor greeting her at the door filled me with a perverse sense of satisfaction. I mused on the French legal system's complexity in evicting tenants, confident I'd be driving a new Mercedes long before she could reclaim her apartment.